Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video we're going to continue our study of the Gospel of St. John, translated into Latin by St. Jerome in the 4th century. In this video we're going to be reading verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1. So let's read the Latin text together, and then we'll go through the translation one word at a time. This is verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 in the Gospel of St. John. Verse 6. Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, ut omnes crederent per illum. Verse 8. Non erat ille lux, sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Verse 9. Erat lux vera, quae illuminat omnem hominem venientem in mundum. Verse 10. In mundo erat, et mundus per ipsum factus est, et mundus eum non cognovit. This is verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John, translated from Greek into Latin by St. Jerome in the 4th century of the Christian era. Let's now work through the translation one verse at a time, one word at a time, as we did in the first lesson. Verse 6 reads, Fuit homo missus a Deo, cui nomen erat Ioannes. Fuit. Fuit means there was. It's a verb. Obviously, you don't understand verb forms yet, since you're just getting started with Latin reading. But you're to memorize the form fuit means there was, or was. There was homo. Homo, we saw that in lesson 1. We saw the noun hominum, of men. Homo is the nominative or dictionary form, the singular form of that noun, and it means man. Fuit homo, there was a man. And remember, as I explained in lesson 1, there are no articles in Latin. So if we add the article a to a man, we need to put that in parentheses when we write it to remind ourselves that that's not actually a translation of something in the Latin, but it's an addition that we're making to clarify our English translation. So, fuit homo, there was a man, missus. Missus. Missus means sent. Think of, in the military, there are missiles. Missiles are bombs or ammunition that's sent through the air. Missus, sent. There was a man sent. A means from. If you look in a dictionary, you may see 3 different forms of this preposition. All of them mean from or by. But you can see this is the basic form, ab, of this preposition. But when this preposition is followed by a word that begins with a consonant, normally this B is dropped, and that's where we get the form a. So here in verse 6 we have a Deo. It's the same thing as ab, but since Deo follows and it starts with a consonant, we drop that B and use a Deo, because it's simply easier to pronounce. A Deo. Fuit homo missus a Deo. There was a man sent a Deo. It could mean from God. It could mean by God. Sent from God, sent by God. In the lesson here, the translation that you're to learn is from. And then Deo is another form of the noun Deus. In lesson 1, we saw Deus. We also saw Deum. And here we see another form, Deo. A Deo, from God. Fuit homo missus a Deo. There was a man sent from God, cui. In lesson 1, we saw the pronoun qui, que, quod. One of the forms of qui is cui. It's the dative form. The dative is usually translated as to or for a thing. And so here we have, there was a man sent from God, cui. For whom? For whom is the translation. Nomen, nomen is the noun for name, for whom the name erat was Ioannes, John. Ioannes is the Latin form of the English name John. And notice that this noun actually begins with the vowel, the Latin vowel E, in English I. And this Ioannes in English, this I becomes J. All right? So in Latin, we pronounce it as an I, Ioannes, Ioannes. But in English, that I, because it has sort of a consonant feel when we pronounce it as a y, over time, changes happened, and it ends up being replaced by the English J. So fuit homo missus a Deo, there was a man sent from God, cui, for whom, nomen, the name, erat, was, Ioannes, John. On to verse 7. Hic venit in testimonium. In lesson 1, we talked about this pronoun, hic, haec, hoc, and I said this is the masculine form of the pronoun. In verse 7, we begin with hic venit in testimonium. Hic is a pronoun, means this. And it refers in verse 7 to Ioannes, this man. There came a man, fuit homo, hic venit. This man came, venit means he came, in testimonium. In testimonium. Now, in verse 1, we saw in principio. We have the preposition in followed by the ablative case of the noun principium, and in this phrase, in, translated in English as in the beginning. Here we see in testimonium. This is not an ablative case, this is an accusative case. So here we have in, the preposition, followed by an ablative case. Here we have in, followed by an accusative case. When in is followed by an accusative case, it has a different meaning than when it's followed by an ablative case. Normally, when in is followed by an ablative case, it has the idea of place, where something is. So, in principio, in the beginning, a place in time. Here, when we see in testimonium, it doesn't express this idea of place. It expresses this idea of direction or destination or purpose. And so it could be translated as into to, or for. And we'll see as we go through our reading, when in is followed by principio, it will have one set of meanings. And when in is followed by an ablative case noun, it'll have one set of meanings. When in is followed by an accusative case, it'll have a different set of meanings. So here I think is our first example of this. In testimonium, you'll see in the lesson that it's translated as for. Hic venit, this man came, in testimonium, for a testimony. For a testimony. Then we read, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. Ut means so, or so that, in this context. Hic venit in testimonium, this man came for a testimony, ut testimonium, so that, testimonium, a testimony, perhiberet, he might give. He might give de lumine. And in de, we have another preposition. We have lumine, which is the ablative form of the noun lumen. So if you look up in the dictionary, you won't find lumine, you'll find lumen. That's the nominative form. Lumine is the ablative form. So the preposition de, followed by the ablative form, has the idea of from, about, concerning, and so on. De lumine. He came for a testimony, so that a testimony he might give, de, about, lumine, the light. About the light. The written translation in the lesson that you're going to study actually uses concerning instead of about. So I just said about, but in your lesson you're going to study concerning, de lumine, concerning the light. Ut omnes crederent per illum. Ut omnes crederent per illum. Ut means so that, and then we have the adjective omnes. Omnes. In lesson 1 we saw omnia, which we translated as all things. This was neuter and plural. Omnes is masculine and plural. So it's not going to be translated as all things, it's going to be translated as all men. The text doesn't say men, but because omnes is masculine, omnes means all, but we understand the substantive men. Omnes, that all men crederent, might believe. Crederent, if you look up in a dictionary, you'll find the verb credo. It means I believe. Crederent, they might believe. Per illum. Per illum. Through him, or by him. Now in lesson 1, we saw the phrase per ipsum, and we translated that as through him, or by him. Here we see a different phrase. We see per again, and we see illum, and again it means through or by him. Two different pronouns with what appears to be the same translation. So what's the difference? What's the difference between these? Normally, ipsum has the idea of himself. Not always, but usually. Illum usually has the idea of some third person. Like him over there, he over there, That's usually the idea expressed by illum. So just a subtle difference, but in English, we don't necessarily make this clear, and that's our own fault in English. But in Latin, there's a distinction between per ipsum, through him, where him has the idea of himself, and per illum, through him, when we're talking about someone else, through him over there. Okay? Hic venit in testimonium, this man came for a testimony, ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine, that a testimony he might give concerning the light, ut omnes crederent per illum, that all might believe through him. Now, before I go on to verse 8, let me just show you one thing that you're going to study in grammar that we see here in our reading. One of the lessons you're going to learn in grammar has to do with substantives and adjectives. You're going to learn that an adjective noun, or I should just say adjective, an adjective cannot stand by itself, but must always be joined to a substantive noun. An adjective has to exist in some person or thing. An adjective cannot exist by itself. An adjective is just a quality. An adjective has to exist in some subject. And so any adjective has to be joined to a substantive noun. In your grammar lessons, you're going to learn that there are two different situations. Sometimes the substantive is expressed, it's named and known from the actual text or from the words that are spoken. So an adjective must always be joined to a substantive. Sometimes the substantive is expressed, that will be considered normal. Sometimes, however, the substantive is not expressed because it's understood. It's understood from the context of what's being spoken of. In verse 7 here, we see two examples of adjectives with understood substantives, and I'll show you. First of all, with the pronoun hic. Hic. Hic what? We could say hic homo. This man. This man. And then later on in verse 7, we see omnes. Omnes what? Omnes what? Omnes just means all. All what? Omnes. Omnes homines. All men. So in verse 7, we have two examples of adjectives that are expressed, that are written without any expressed substantive, where the substantive is understood. Now, again, this grammatical information is not required on your tests in Latin Reading 1. I simply want to comment on these things while we go through. So if you're studying Latin Grammar 1 at the same time, which you should be, you can pick up examples of your grammar rules in the reading as we go along. So I hope that's helpful, but it's not going to be required on any test. Just pay attention and learn some of the grammar as we go along, and it'll help you in your grammar studies. All right, so that was verse 7. Moving on to verse 8. Non erat ille lux. Non erat ille lux. Non, we saw in lesson 1, it means not. Non erat, not was. Ille, ille means he. I just showed you illum. We saw illum in verse 7. Ille is the nominative or dictionary form of illum. It means he. Not was he lux, the light. Not was he, the man who came from God. Not was he, the light. Sed ut testimonium perhiberet de lumine. But so that a testimony, perhiberet, he might give, de lumine, concerning the light. he was not the light. The man who came from God was not the light. The one we spoke about in verses 1 through 5, the verbum. The man who came from God was not that one. He was not the Word. He was not the light. But he came, this man, so that a testimony he might give concerning the light. Verse 8. On to verse 9. Erat lux vera. Erat lux vera. It was, or he was, lux vera. Lux means light, vera means true. And here we have an example of an adjective with an expressed substantive. We have lux vera. Vera is the adjective, means true, and lux is the substantive, true light. This is an example of an adjective with an expressed substantive. Lux vera, erat lux vera. He was the true light. Que means which. In lesson 1, I showed you the pronoun quique quod. Que is feminine. And this can be confusing because que means who, and yet it's feminine, and we're talking about men. We're talking about two men so far. We've talked about the Word, and we've talked about this man John. We're talking about men. Why are we using a feminine pronoun? The reason why is because this pronoun refers to lux, which, as I said in lesson 1, lux is a feminine substantive. And so the pronoun that stands in place of lux is also going to be feminine. So, erat lux vera, he was the true light. Que refers back to lux, which illuminat, that's a verb, illuminates, which illuminates or enlightens, omnem hominem. And here again, we have an example of an adjective followed by an expressed substantive. Omnem hominem. Omnem hominem, every man. When omnis is used in the singular, it's translated every. When it's used in the plural, it's translated all. So omnia, all things. Omnem hominem, every man. Erat lux vera, it was the true light. Que illuminat omnem hominem, which illuminates or enlightens every man. Venientem in mundum. Venientem means coming. We saw venit before. Hic venit. That means he came. Here we see another form. Venientem, which means coming. This is a different part of speech. This is what we call a participle. A participle is a part of speech. It's a word that acts like an adjective but has the form of, or derives its form from a verb. It has tense like a verb, but it's used like an adjective in speech. Venientem is an example of a participle, which you'll learn about in Latin grammar. So it was the true light which illuminates or enlightens every man. Venientem, coming, every man coming, in mundum, into the world. And this is another example of the preposition in, followed by an accusative case where it doesn't have the translation in, but it has the idea of movement, into the world, in mundum. And again, I know that this grammar information may be overwhelming, but you can watch this video as many times as you like, and as you study grammar and review your lessons, all of this will be helpful and give you examples of all of your grammar rules. So bear with me as I comment on the grammar. Venientem in mundum, coming into the world. That's verse 9. Lastly, verse 10. In mundo erat. In mundo erat. In mundo erat. And here we have a good chance to compare these two phrases. We just saw venientem in mundum. And now here in verse 10, we see in mundo erat. Here we have the preposition en followed by the accusative case of the noun. Here we have the preposition in followed by the ablative case of the noun. In verse 9, in is translated as into the world. In verse 10, in is translated as in the world. The ablative within signifies place. The accusative within signifies destination or purpose. In mundum, into the world. In mundo, in the world. All right, so verse 10. In mundo erat. In the world he was. Et mundus. Et means and. It's a conjunction. Mundus is another substantive noun. It means the world. This is the nominative or dictionary case. Mundus. We've seen mundum and mundo. These are just different forms of the substantive noun mundus. The world, per ipsum, by or through him, factus est. In lesson 1 we saw factum est, we saw facta sunt. Here we see factus est, made is. Et mundus, and the world, eum means him, non cognovit, not did know. Cognovit means he did know, non cognovit means he did not know. In mundo erat, in the world he was. Et mundus per ipsum factus est, and the world through him or by him made is. Et mundus eum non cognovit, and the world him not did know. Now notice there in verse 10, one more little grammar lesson. We see this sentence, mundus eum non cognovit. And we translate this as the world him not did know. Now this ending simply means he, she, or it did know. How do we know whether this refers to him or mundus? What's the subject? The answer is not the word order. It doesn't matter that mundus comes first. The subject doesn't necessarily come first in Latin. The way that we know what the subject of the verb is by the ending. This is in the nominative case. Eum is in the accusative case. Because this is in the nominative case, it's the subject of the verb. The world did not know. Him. This is the object of the verb because it's in the accusative case. All right, so the word order does not tell us what's the subject and what's the object of the verb. So don't guess by word order. You have to know the cases of the different parts of the sentence because that's the only way to understand the function of the words and their relationship to the verb. You're going to learn that in grammar, but I want you to make sure you pay attention to see word order does not tell us how to translate a sentence from Latin into English. We saw this in lesson 1 where we saw et Deus erat verbum, and God was the Word. And we saw that in English translation, it's actually written as, and the Word was God. Verbum is moved to the front because it is actually the subject, not Deus. So as you study grammar, I'll try to show you the examples of all of the rules that you learn in grammar as we go through Latin reading. And remember, I'm only commenting on grammar to provide you some insight into what's going on in the language, assuming that you're studying Latin grammar while you're working through Latin reading. As for your actual lesson assignments and assessment, you don't need to know this grammar information. I would just like you to listen, pay attention, and start to pick up some of the lessons as we go along. So you have lots of examples of Latin grammar. But for your actual studies, you simply need to know the vocabulary, and you need to learn that vocabulary through the translation exercises I explained in Lesson 1. That's all for verses 6 through 10. So we've walked through that translation. I've provided some commentary on the vocabulary and on the grammar. All of the translation is written word for word in your printed lesson, so you don't have to rely on this video. I hope the video is helpful. If you have any questions, please contact me. I'd be happy to go into more detail or explain anything that you feel I left out. Just get in touch. God bless you.